Um, we've learned now that President Trump approved military strikes against Iran in retaliation for downing a U.S. military drone. He called that strike off 10 minutes before it was scheduled to happen. We know that GOP leaders, including Kevin McCarthy, have said there should be some sort of measured response to the downing of the drone. What is your own position on this issue? Do you agree with the GOP leaders that we need to see some sort of retaliation, and what might that look like?
Well, absolutely, there has to be some response to that provocative act, unprovoked act. But it does need to be measured, and I think that's what the president's trying to decide now is whether it needs to be a kinetic strike, like was being planned, or something in the way of other diplomatic approaches to put pressure on them. Well, but I don't know what his thinking is right now. But I think he is going to take some response, make some response.
Do you believe some members of Congress have said the president, before he takes any sort of action, should come before Congress and request a AUMF, an authorization for military use of force? You sound like you are opposed to that. You believe that the president now has the authority to launch military attacks against Iran?
Correct. I think he does. And I don't think that, I mean, he did take the time to consult with Congress yesterday. He had the leaders of both chambers over, as well as leading members of the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and a couple of others to talk with them about what he should do. So he did consult with Congress as he was trying to decide what action to take. But when you have a country like Iran shoot down an American drone in international airspace, I don't think we need to have 3 months of argument in the Congress to decide what needs to be done. We have him as a commander-in-chief to make decisions like this, and that doesn't matter whether it's a Democrat or Republican. I felt the same way about Barack Obama when he was president. Now, if we're going to get into a war, a long-term war, it's a different story. But he needs to take action, I think, in a quick manner. Whether it's sanctions or a kinetic attack, he needs to make that call, but there has to be a response. Otherwise, you're going to see countries like North Korea, China, and Russia becoming much more provocative in their actions toward us, so they know that we're going to be paralyzed and unable to respond.
The other big story out of the Pentagon this week was Pat Shanahan, the acting defense secretary, taking himself out of the running and out of that confirmation process to become the permanent defense secretary. President Trump is moving forward and has selected Mark Esper, who is the Secretary of the Army, to replace him as acting defense secretary. Do you have concerns, though, that we are now 7 months of having an acting defense secretary? Trump will have to go back to the drawing board and find a new nominee to head up the Pentagon full-time, especially at this time of increased activity in the Persian Gulf and with North Korea, and plus you have thousands of migrants showing up on our southern border. Do you have concerns about the fact that we have no permanent Senate-confirmed defense secretary?
I do. I mean, the fact is I was concerned before this change that Secretary Shanahan was in an acting role. This is the largest organization on the planet. They need a confirmed secretary leading it. I'm also very disappointed that Secretary Shanahan is resigning. He was a top-notch secretary, very competent, doing a great job, and I think that it's just awful that he has had to pull back to protect his family from what he was going through. But Secretary Esper is going to be great. I hope that the Senate will confirm him soon. He'll do a great job. But we don't need to have these acting secretaries in charge of these large organizations. It's just not helpful at all.
Anna?
Yeah, Congressman, as the ranking member on the House Homeland Security Committee, I want to talk to you. You've been to the border plenty. You visited. Media is not allowed in Border Patrol stations, so they haven't been able to see the overcrowding and the conditions there. But this week, one congresswoman compared them to concentration camps. So what have you seen on the ground in the last few months when you've been down to the border?
Well, it's a crisis. You know, it's a humanitarian crisis, and it's not manufactured. It's real, and it's getting worse. The fact is, for each of the last 3 months, we've had over 100,000 migrants coming across our border. In March, it was 104,000. In April, it was 109,000. In May, it was 144,000. So you can see the trend lines. This is not going to get better, and we just aren't equipped right now to deal with this huge volume of migrants. And it's a different set of migrants. You know, in the recent past, we've dealt with single males, typically from Mexico. Now we have these family units coming across in huge numbers, many women and children, and we just aren't set up to handle them. I'm disappointed that y'all aren't allowed to get in and see these processing facilities, but our CBP is set up to handle a maximum of 4,000 individuals in these processing facilities, and we have over 20,000 in there right now. And you know, we can't let this go on. You know, some folks may not, on the Democrat side, may not like President Trump or his policies, but this is not about President Trump and his policies. This is a humanitarian crisis. These women and children and men need to have housing, they need to have health care, while we try to determine who is appropriate for allowing into our country and who needs to be sent back. But they got to have some place to stay while they're here. You know, they come across, you know, from Central America through Mexico, and by the time they get here, most of them are in very poor health. This can't just be ignored, and so I'm hopeful that soon the Democrats will allow my authorization bill to appropriate $4.5 billion in supplemental funding to help deal with this. Because, you know, when President Trump was talking about wanting to get money for the border barrier, the Democrat Party kept saying, well, you know, we don't really need barriers, they don't work. What we need is money for health care, for transportation, for housing. Well, that's all this authorization or appropriations bill is. It's $4.5 billion to provide that kind of assistance to this border crisis. So when I hear members of the Democrat Party talk about our processing centers as being similar to concentration camps, first of all, I'm just terribly offended, because these are nothing close to concentration camps. We've got Border Patrol agents buying toys with their own personal money, diapers and food with their own personal money, trying to take care of these families. But if they really think that the conditions are deplorable, then bring an appropriations bill to the floor to give the Border Patrol and Health and Human Services the money they need to take care of these people.
Now, there is an appropriations bill